you know, everybody talks about new services, and you know, sometimes I think 10 years ago I was giving presentations talking about new services, and digital was going to be the end-all, be-all, and we now talk about spectrum and new services. Maybe, you know, Ian, starting with you, and then we'll go down, you know, the panel. Do you guys actually see, with where we are with spectrum today and the spectrum available for broadcasters and other services, you know, is the future of these new consumer services really achievable? Is it here? And just, you know, where do we see that going?
A good question. I think we have to break the issue down into two. First of all, multi-screen services and ad hoc consumption is certainly growing. From our perspective, users' expectation to access not only linear schedule but multi-screen services is certainly having an impact on the valuation of spectrum. What we're finding now is that with spectrum reallocation happening, and I mean many of the decisions have been made here and now, a lot of the regulators are trying to make the decision, do we actually leave spectrum as being broadcast specific, or do we reallocate spectrum for mobile services, for OTT and VOD services? Now, there's a free flow happening within this environment, and I think it's fair to say that a lot of the traditional broadcasters are looking over the fence at the OTT providers and saying, what are they doing? Because in many areas like 4K VOD, Netflix and Sony streaming are certainly stealing a march. So there is a healthy reallocation, and I think either you can get defensive about this and saying, oh my goodness, broadcast spectrum is disappearing, what are we going to do? Or you can actually look optimistically at it and say, well, this is really tracking viewing preferences. Many of the younger demographic are going to sort of ad hoc viewing, which tends to favour allocating spectrum on more finer granularity for access to specific channels, access to particular programming, rather than having dedicated channels. So I take quite an optimistic view. I think it's good for the industry. I think we've got to actually acknowledge the fact that consumption patterns are changing, and you know, we've got to be open-minded about that change.
Okay, well, where do I begin? I'm not the broadcaster. What am I? Well, set the scene a little here. Interference reduction. There's a geeky subject. That gets us all depressed immediately. Where does that all fit with this, what Ian just said? Well, I'd like to think optimistically too. We are an engineering group, fundamentally. Our real role is to deal with fixing interference on satellite transmissions. Things like Rich has mentioned, carrier ID, we've got various other initiatives with GVF, Global VSAT Forum, etc. Lots of us working to make things better. We work particularly with VSAT systems, building tools for satellite operators to fix and find where terminals are going wrong, etc., etc. So where am I going with this in the broadcast sense? Well, of course, spectrum, as you know, I'm not sure, I'll be a little negative for a moment. There's a bit of a battle going on between us and them, the satellite versus the mobile. And that's all happening in November, as some of you know, at WRC 15. It's going to be big. My take, and our group's take, we're not into the regulatory thing. It's engineering and technology that gets us out of this. And I think the mistake, perhaps, of the industry has been that the engineers of both sides perhaps haven't got together enough to start figuring out how we use these wonderful technologies that are coming along. And the fact we need everything. The broadcaster needs mobile as much as he needs his fixer. He needs everything. So I think the word hybrid has to come into this conversation. And people like Intelsat are already providing hybrid networks. This is good. This is a good thing. And this is why we have two good guys here. We've got Novalsat and we have Harmonic. There are plenty of others too, but you're going to hear that they do this type of technology, but these guys care too. These guys care about delivering service quality and making sure that things like interference are a thing of the past. by developing smarter modulation methods, just being smart. Let's not worry about all the technology right now. So very unusual here in this panel. I noticed Rich put me smack in the middle here. Thank you, Rich. And I could duck and dive, and I could be quite miserable about this, but I am not. I am like Ian, and I'm sure Itzik will agree with me that this is good stuff. We have to change. And I think the satellite industry has to also change. It is actually. It's just we're in a bit of a negative moment because of the battle, guess what? The big battle of C-band. And this region needs C-band. And we need it because things like what has happened in Nepal recently brings it well home to us. We need some of those frequencies have to be protected too. It is a problem, but that's enough dwelling on the slightly negative side. I come back to my optimistic field. Hybrid networks. We've got to work the technologies, and these technologies do migrate across both areas of both the mobile industry and the satellite industry, and each industry needs each other. So engineer our way forward. That's where I'm coming from. Thank you.
I would like to widen the question a little bit. It's not just about broadcasters. Today we are facing somehow the conflict on the C-band between the cellular network and the other use of satellite. But I believe behind the corner, some much more demand for spectrum is waiting for us. That's a whole bunch of new LEO constellations, with some forecasts speaking about between 5,000 to 10,000 new satellites starting 2019, with all those LEO applications, which many of them require direct connectivity between the satellite and the handsets or the consumer appliances. It may be Internet of Things or consumer appliances. The demand, the chaos which today is creating on the C-band will definitely be on the KU and probably on the KA as well. We should take into account that the spectrum is a limited given resource. You can't expand it. You have what you have, but you can use it much more wisely. For example, a lot of things taking as given today should be re-questioned. For example, with antennas, cross-pole interference. Today it's given. I'm not sure this is the way it should be in the future. There are a lot of other techniques which we have already employed, kind of having a much more interference-resilient modulation schemes, adding algorithmic elements into the modulation scheme, which is interference resilient. There are a lot of, and this is just already there, and just by adding that, we have been able to get additional 15 dB of better resilience than standard technology, and this is just the beginning. I believe in many areas which today it seems the conflict is given, it shouldn't be that. For example, on the C-band, there are ways which are our concrete roadmap to let coexistence of LTE and any kind of satellite transmission, and I don't care if it's broadcast or data communication or whatever, or Internet of Things or whatever there, but there are ways, technical ways, to allow coexistence and to have a better utilization of the spectrum than done today. Until today, it has been easy. There have been a lot of available spectrum, but one thing is given, the amount of radiators is increasing daily as we speak. It may be professional or commercial radiators, or it may be even the handset. In certain, there are billions of handsets already in the market. In certain situations where they're getting quite too close to the antenna or too close to some critical equipment, and the amount of pollution in the air increases as we speak. If we will not be able, by means of technology, because there are no other way to do it by means of technology to enable coexistence, then a lot of then actually progress, technology progress will be stopped, and there's no reason for that. I believe there's still a lot of work to be done before we come to any critical point.
Thank you. You know, kind of building on where you were going, Itzhak, do you have a thought on, you know, different strategies operators could use to improve spectral efficiency, whether it be, you know, technologies that are available today or areas in industry we ought to be looking at to improve the utilization of spectrum?
Some of the measure has been done today, but there's a lot, and we have a detailed roadmap in order to enable, as I said, coexistence of different radiators. Let's call it the most generic way: broadcasted, satellite communication, Internet of Things, whatever will come there, and I believe there will come much more. As I said before, just one of the major waves which we are expecting, and I believe it will require much more spectrum than all available spectrum today. The Leo tsunami which is waiting for us. So there's very specific ways that I believe the best way for the broadcasters actually to work together with the technology vendors and to promote those technology. Those technology actually are costly to develop, and without having the industry support or industry finance or industry demand this way or the other, it will develop much slower. End of the day, it must be developed. But broadcasters who want to benefit from it should work with the technology, with the vendors, and to enable those things to happen sooner than later.
Thank you. I don't know, Martin, similar question.
I think it's just giving me another enormous headache of the interference. Can you think, and I like the word pollution, because interference is a pollutant if we let it keep going. And if you think about growth, it is a problem. And here we go, we're going back down and sliding rapidly into the negative again. The thing is, I think there's something Itzhak said also, was the working together bit. That's how we got carrier ID to fly. It was an impossible, everybody talked about it, but it wasn't going to fly. You have to work together. It takes technology people, it takes engineers, it takes processes, it takes planning. And it's not easy. Tell me, it is really not easy. Just carrier ID, one thing. It has been hard. And as you rightly say, it's going to be hard if the broadcasters don't work more closely, or everyone work more closely. Then we can all provide the services. We've got to get that piece of spectrum to work for us. And operators will need help. Everybody will need help. We need to plan better. We need to organise ourselves better. I think it's something IRG can do. Certainly engineering, we're already in there. We're thinking the big data type problems, because data just is growing. So things like the arguments between mobile industry and satellite about mobile says it's going to grow so much and satellites say it isn't. Well, don't know. I'm not sure. What is the growth? I think it's going to be quite spectacular, would be my summation of that. So it's this working together and planning and being organised. And I don't think we're organised enough. But I think, I have to say, from the people I've got in our group, people I know like these guys here, it is technology that's starting to give us the lead to get us out of the mess. But we are heading for a mess, sadly, but I think technology can do it. I hear, perhaps pick up on that.
Well, I mean, I like the analogy where you talk about spectrum being like seafront real estate. I mean, there are other analogies that are used that it's almost like highways. The more highways you build, the more traffic you attract. And I think if we're getting back to the thing about spectrum efficiency and efficient spectral use, there are a number of factors. First of all, if you were looking at linear scheduled, actually endorsing sort of the latest compression techniques, to successively reduce by significant factors of anywhere between 30 and 50% the bandwidth that your HD channel uses, or enabling new channels like UHD to come along. But I think actually there are a number of other trends that broadcasters are dealing with. First of all, the expectation for more and diverse traffic, in the fact that not only is it the living room screen that you're viewing on, it's the multi-screen environment. Now, I think that broadcasters, unless you really squeeze them, or even content aggregators or IP suppliers, they're all been to this day quite wasteful in terms of the spectrum that they've used. You look at the way that national broadcaster will use the national feed and contribute local programming. Often that implies complete duplication of spectrum or spectrum usage. Now, you could actually use the reinvention of the industry to introduce things like targeted advertising, splicing local and national content, so thereby reducing the number of duplicate channels that there are also being transmitted. I think another interesting move is broadcasters have felt compelled to actually broadcast in each format as and when it comes about. So this has resulted in not only linear scheduled broadcasts of SD, HD, and now Ultra HD, but also a myriad of multi-screen formats. Now, either broadcasters can sacrifice their margin to keep ahead of this race, or fundamentally change what they're doing and saying, we will broadcast in one mezzanine format, that it is the responsibility of the local carrier to actually then transcode or present that material in those formats. And we're already beginning to see those kind of changes transitioning, with significant public broadcasters saying, we no longer can keep on top of this multi-format environment, that we must look more to operate as, say, the telecoms industry does, where it often uses one mezzanine audio codec and then actually uses local point of presence to actually break out. So I think in all of these ways, for linear scheduled TV, it's got to be more efficient in terms of compression, more efficient in terms of how it actually deals with national and affiliate feeds, endorse the use of mezzanine formats and more regional transcoding, so that deals with the linear side, plus also embrace the more ad hoc viewing of it and not view it as being a satellite versus IP type discussion, and more the fact that satellite, cable and terrestrial have their view to supporting IP streaming or dedicated broadcast infrastructure. So I think there are a number of fronts that can really further spectrum efficiencies.
Ian, if you could, I'm just kind of curious, when you mentioned like the deployment of Ultra HD, HD, and SD, you're transmitting multiple services, or older compression technologies. Do you know of an estimate, or do you have an opinion on, if operators today reinvested in technology, how much more capacity, or whether it's spectrum or you think of payload capacity, what type of gain would be available if people who were operating MPEG-2 moved to an MPEG-4 and HEVC or the like?
Well, I think there are two ways of answering your question. If you were comparing the move from SD to HD, where MPEG AVC was used, the headline figure was saying it would offer a 50% improvement. And certainly 50% was the figure that most people were aiming for, that at point of launch, most people were actually achieving 30-35%. And as we've gone on, AVC, hit that 50% figure. So a like-for-like replacement, that would be the kind of figure that we're looking to. The HD to UHD example is a particularly interesting example, because broadcasters can no longer say, we had SD, we're going to put a parallel chain in to deal with UHD. That what people are saying is that this is part of a multi-screen streaming environment. We have to offer these services alongside the existing services. Now, in a roundabout way, what I'm saying is that HEVC does offer the same potential that AVC proposed, where it says 50% headline improvement. And certainly for the larger screen formats, it can deliver more than 50%, because a lot of the efficiencies that HEVC has to offer are particularly targeted at dealing with large format screens. So I think that you are looking at launch now that HEVC here and now is delivering the network's efficiencies that people would like to see to alleviate the most important network congestion, and that is in HD. It's in HD movies. You look at any of the state of the internet type reports that are predicting anywhere between 60 to 75% network utilization. The headline grabbing figure may well be UHD with HEVC, but certainly it's the backhaul of HD that is the main bottleneck and is the main area that people are looking to see. So one of the things that I do a lot of is actually comparisons of AVC and HEVC, and people always like these figures. So for a premium sports channel, you could be looking at, say, anywhere between 10 to 15 megabits using MPEG-4 at the moment. For the top end premium type capability, if you were replicating that for HD, you'd be looking at somewhere between, say, 4 and 6 megabits with HEVC. Now, for UHD services, they've got to remain equivalent and not overuse bandwidth. So a lot of the early services that you're seeing, say from Netflix or Sony Streaming, are saying they're using 22 megabits, of which 16 megabits is the HEVC payload. The development of HEVC will bring that down to 10 megabits. And I suppose the main thing is people are looking to see more for the same usage of spectrum. So where you're seeing sort of 10 to 15 megabits being used at the top end for premium sports, for HD AVC, people are going to be very quickly looking to see equivalent type performance in UHD using that same spectrum.
Thank you. I guess we'll ask another question, then we'll open it up to the floor. You know, Itzhak, if you could, you know, when we talk about spectrum, we've talked a little bit about its use relative to satellite. We also hear, you know, in certain parts of the world, broadcasters either concerned, I think the message earlier was a defensive versus an embracing, I think, approach. You know, do we see the spectrum, whether you call it reallocation or right sizing, you know, usage, challenge to digital terrestrial television, or you know, how does that stake the future of, you know, broadcasters who may be looking to go in that direction? Do we see the spectrum crunch really stopping them from going, or is that maybe just a worry that's not to be foreseen?
I believe that there's still a room in certain areas, almost of multiples of available usage of the spectrum. Namely, the spectrum is given, but spectral efficiency in certain area probably it's quite close to the channel limit. I'm not speaking about compression, which is a different issue which we do not address. We just address the spectral efficiency, namely getting out more megabit per megahertz, and whatever is done, and the megabit can serve for any purpose. But on certain area, especially in area of interference area, and I believe about, according to markets research, about 50% of the spectrum is polluted this way or the other. Some of them which are not defined polluted are practically polluted kind. I just brought one example of the cross-pole interference between in the antenna, but the cross interfere between the poles. Today it's given, I'm not sure that's it must remain that way. So I believe for polluted area you can get multiples of multiples of the available spectrum, for example, in an area like extended C-band and so forth, which practically there are transponders practically abandoned because of interference. Then you can reuse them. In some areas you can more than double or triple the available capacity by properly handling the interference. I just want to add that I believe the interference problem we are seeing today is just a foreplay for what we are going to see with the LEO. Just imagine 5,000 to 10,000 satellites on the air compared to the about 500 FSS satellites you see today, not coordinated between them and by theoretically they cannot be because they are moving targets compared to the static ones today, and we will see a very interesting world. So I believe in order to enable, and I don't see too many people addressing it, but I believe with the right handling we can more than in certain area we can get multiples of the existing bandwidth.
Keeps depressing me with those numbers.
It's a conspiracy.
It's a conspiracy. It's got to be, yeah. I mean, we're back to this. We're back to into the technology's got to solve this. But I mean, I often wonder, what's the new IP? What happens? We keep talking about IP, the network side. What is it? We compress things on our streaming and the stuff we watch. But what about our ordinary networks? How many office blocks are just jammed up with their own networks? We waste even the network space. Even we keep getting faster, but we're just not dealing with being efficient. Think about it on your mobile phone still with just 3G. Google, just getting the search page up can take a while. How much data is that? So it's not just what we do. Everywhere's got to be looked at. The mobile, they have to look at their patch. And I know that's all interleaved, and I'm sure you guys can technically put me back on track at any time. But we need to be efficient everywhere. That spectrum is only being fixed because the hubs and everything and all the network switches are getting faster. We're not solving the fundamental problem of the carrying of big data, because that's what this is about. Everything you and I want is big data in whatever form it comes in, but it's a lot of it now, and we have to get it right. And ignoring all the satellites for a moment, I'm not going down that one. That's another job. That'll be tomorrow. What are we doing about all that? And we need to work hard there. It's not my forte, but I do question it. I mean, any thoughts on that side, on the network itself?
Well, I think a lot of the broadcasters are getting quite savvy in terms of their usage, both of satellite spectrum and also in terms of broadband-enabled services, that this pitching of linear scheduled versus IP, I think many of the broadcasters and content aggregators have moved quite far on from that. And they're offering genuine hybrid services that offer the best of both worlds for bulk viewing, recognizing that existing satellite and terrestrial is the best way to actually quickly distribute and broadcast material. And I mean, I think that anyone who thinks that broadband distribution for mass events like the World Cup and the Olympics is still disillusioned, because basically a lot of the broadband networks just do not have the capacity to actually scale for the delivery of real-time video, and that is where satellite and cable do have their forte. But that's not to say that the big broadcasters shouldn't be presenting the hybrid set-top boxes that they've got for ad hoc long-tail content that, after all, you know, we're of a certain age and demographic that, you know, by the end of the day we sit back and watch linear TV, but our kids are up in their room using dad's broadband to access countless ad hoc services. So I think that the successful broadcasters have blended between the existing DTH forms of delivery plus IP multi-screen. And that's a significant change, and that's quite a savvy change to recognize how to actually use spectrum. I also think that this idea of format independence delivery and actually recognizing that multi-screen doesn't just mean second screen like your smartphone or your PC. It can in fact mean the launch of new formats like Ultra HD will mean that things like MPEG-Dash will harmonize the approach that's being used, and that does have an impact for spectral efficiency also.
Excellent, thank you. Now, if anyone from the floor has a question they'd like to direct to the entire panel or anyone specifically on the panel, don't all stand up at once. If you don't ask a question, we might call on you.
Tricky subject.
Well, I know, Lindsay, I know you're sitting there thinking about a question you'd like to direct to someone on the panel. And since I thought I'd get away with it, I would call on you, so. We can repeat the question if you'd like.
Okay, so I think our panel here have a lot of experience in the satellite area, but one of the big debates that goes on amongst broadcasters is to do with terrestrial spectrum, UHF, and not just for distribution, also for program making. So I would say that the other debate about the higher frequencies, which is more to do with the debate between, say, the satellite industry and mobile, this is also an area for program production for wireless cameras. So maybe the panel could reflect on a broader range of use of spectrum by broadcasters and how this debate about sharing, which we heard earlier, how this might play out.
Who wants to go at that?
Well,
you go.
I'll go first. I mean, I think it's a very good point because, I mean, most people fixate on the impact of spectrum reallocation on distribution, and there are certainly some figures banded about, particularly with 700 megahertz reallocation. But here and now for broadcast production that has reliance on certain frequencies, what's being contemplated for spectrum for video acquisition and production would make the reallocation of frequencies for wireless mics look Mickey Mouse, because it would have a significant effect on existing practice for wireless cameras. Now, I think undoubtedly the file-based production can alleviate some of that problem, but not all of it, simply because the vast majority of people have already moved to IP or file-based systems if they possibly can do in their production workflow. But there is a real bottleneck associated with the allocation of frequency specifically used for video production purposes. And I think this is where the debate being somewhat emotive about how much DTH spectrum will be lost, the production usage has got lost in that. And I think that that is one of the key arguments, because your news would look totally different if you cannot have, you know, COFDM-based wireless production and the preservation of certain frequencies that are key. And I think that with a lot of these arguments, you've got to come up with a compromise solution. And I think that unfortunately for production usage and the preservation of those vital frequencies that are essential for news coverage, that's been overlooked. And I do think there should be more emphasis on preserving spectrum where it's actually needed and where there is no alternative and where it does actually form part of production practice, and not just roll all of the issues into one where it won't be properly recognised.
For my take is, we're back to being organised. To me, it's a knee-jerk reaction every time we do something else. We throw in the 700 meg, excuse me, and go somewhere else. But it's all knee-jerk. We're not actually planning and thinking about all these frequencies and how we do use them in the future. You know, I can see WRC 15 being a mess. I don't know what the result's going to be. I have no idea. It's not my expertise at all. But we're not planning it, are we? We knee-jerk our way round. and then everybody's fighting again because someone else wants that bit. We never get out of a fight. When we should be, somehow, we got this resource. It's like oil. I keep thinking of the oil. We're going to run out of the stuff. There's only a finite amount of oil. It's the spectrum. And everybody says, no, you can keep going higher and higher and we'll be into optical and it's fine. It still has, it's only so much. And we have to look after it. So shouldn't we, all of us, and it's not just broadcasters, I'm talking the industry, and it's pretty big, not just satellites, we've got to organise and sort it out. You'd think the ITU could do that, but I'm not so sure. I think it's going to be us.
I think one thing that is the point, this sort of broadcaster use versus mobile use, it's swinging from one extreme to the other, where it's sort of either using it all for broadcast usage or all for mobile usage. And I think there is a halfway house point, particularly for contribution networks and wireless camera, where the bidding process for spectrum should support ad hoc usage, because after all, most of the argument today has been concentrated on reallocation of spectrum, so it moves from DTT spectrum to mobile spectrum. But one of the significant benefits would be to free up more of that spectrum for ad hoc usage and to actually enable it to be used as a more generalized surface, in the way that a lot of the satellite operators have had to adjust the granularity that they actually make bandwidth available. And I think the fear is that it's going to move from being DTT spectrum to being mobile spectrum, with no provision for the flexibility that people would hope could be offered by spectrum reallocation.
I'm a little bit skeptical. I believe the demand for spectrum raises much faster than any ability to organize, all these committees. It takes time. It's much slower than the increase in spectrum demand in all areas. Just pick an area from cellular, which increases almost exponentially every year, to video broadcast, which the amount of channels increases every year, to video technology, we're moving to standard definition, high definition, and so forth. So I believe when it comes to reorganizing, convening a lot of people together, a lot of nations together, coming to understanding all this political process, with a lot of politics or interest behind it, it's a much, much slower process than the increase in bandwidth demand. The only way, I believe, is technology, because technology companies has been proven the capability to address such issues much faster than just kind of a UN-like organization which takes them forever to address an issue. So I don't say stop with this, it needed to be in parallel, but if you base your hope on all these organizations and getting to some standard understanding, then we will get very fast to kind of a block there.
Thank you. Well, clearly the spectrum usage debate is one that broadly touches a lot of parts of the operations of broadcasters, of network operators, and carriers. It seems, if we kind of think across the, the panel's concepts, moving forward, clear organization for the, organized use of spectrum the most efficient way possible, technology drivers to ensure that we're putting the most efficient use of content through the spectrum we have, looking at the existing operations and trying to reduce duplication, thinking about it in a hybrid environment, are all steps that we're going to have to take for efficient spectrum utilization moving forward. Well, I'd like to thank all the members of the panel here and everyone for participating today. I believe our break for lunch is next. I apologize, we were running a little late from a late start, but thank you everyone for participating today.